Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress, Chapter 11. Those Who Watch the Door. Those Who Watch the Door. After resting for a while inside the study, with Valesh, Ravsese and Piecora taking turns keeping watch, they all gathered around the small doorway in the back left corner of the room, next to the female Unscavian statue. Stone steps led down into dark depths beyond the doorway. They were worn smooth with rounded edges, as if created centuries ago. Sharp, cold air emanated from the doorway, and a light mist, barely noticeable from the rest of the room, hovered over the ground and wisped around the edges of the doorway as the two different environments mingled. "Steady," said Piecora, holding the lamp in front of her through the doorway. "A friend once warned me of doorways that lead to unexpected places. The air is much colder on the other side here. Watch your footing." She stepped through the doorway first, followed by Valesh, Ortor, and then Ravsese, who carried the second lamp. She didn't very much like being in the rear, despite acknowledging that it was best for Piecora to lead the way and keep the children between them. The walls around them were made from large stone bricks that were rounded and smooth from great age, much like the steps. The low ceiling was mere inches above Piecora's antlers. Puffs of steam blew from each of their mouths as they descended the steps. The air itself was musty and stagnant, as if were somehow trapped down here despite the open doorway above them. The mineral-like aroma smelled of ancient stone, mildew, and age-encrusted ice. Something glinted from a step before Ravsese, and kneeling down, she picked up what looked like a metal shaving from a blacksmith's anvil or the outer shell of a large clam. About the size of her hand, it was flat and slightly curved, rounded most of the way, except for one side which tapered to a near point, where the metal was thinnest, almost translucent. To Ravsese, it looked like the loose scale from a large fish. She noticed Piecora had stopped as well, and she was looking down around her at several more of these metal scales lying on the stone steps, mostly gathered against the walls on either side. Piecora shrugged her shoulders at Ravsese and kept going while Ravsese pocketed the metal shard in her cloak. A few steps further, and Ortor pocketed one for himself, looking back at Ravsese to see if it was allowed. She nodded and gently turned him back around by the shoulders so they could keep moving forward. As they descended the narrow tunnel, the air grew colder, and then even colder still. It felt like descending into icy water. Ravsese gathered her cloak around her and pulled her hood over her head, shivering while she checked on Ortor in front of her. He didn't seem as bothered by the temperature as she was, but she just considered that was due to her sensitive skin and overall frailty. After a long descent, they heard a soft, low rumble below them, drawn out like heavy wind through a narrow crevice between boulders. This was followed by another sound, also sustained for several long moments, like water running through loose stones. They all stopped and listened, and the sounds repeated slowly together, one after the other, in a lazy, soothing cadence that reminded Ravsese of breathing. Then something shifted from below, like rocks grinding against metal, and the small tunnel trembled slightly, bringing down clouds of dust around them. But it was brief, and shortly after the tunnel became still again. Slowly and quietly, they crept down the remaining stone steps until they emerged into a chamber of smooth, ancient stone masonry that looked nothing like the city above them. The floor was tiled with large flat stones carved into sweeping curves, like aspects of interlocking machinery that looked nothing to Ravsese like Muthan or Brenzage design, or even Canonian based on her limited knowledge this country. The walls were the same construction of ancient stone bricks that they saw in the tunnel behind them, all weathered from indiscriminate age. The ceiling was taller than the tunnel, perhaps 2 stories tall, like the remade mansion above them. The chamber itself was wider on either side than the tunnel, perhaps by 100 meters that went beyond the light of the 2 lamps carried by Piecora and Ravses. Metal shards and shavings of various sizes littered the floor beneath their feet like fallen leaves. All 4 of them stood in total silence at what lay before them, so far beneath the city. Here was a place that existed long before and further below Canonian and even Callistico histories. This was a world not meant for them. Reclined in a curled position like a resting cat with its tail looped around its body was a gigantic lizard, larger than 2 draft horses from nose to tail, its scales gleaming metallically in the blue frozen light from the shimmering circular plane of ice behind it. All around the vertical glassy disc were large mounds of ice and frozen minerals, both native and foreign to this world. Crystalline stalagmites grew from the floor to the ceiling, framing the disc like a mirror set organically within its own surrounding ice cave, as if it had always been here since the making of the world. The metallic lizard had leathery wings folded on its back, and beneath it was a pile of thick carpets, rugs, tapestries, and animal furs that lay on the frozen, uneven ground before the suspended icy disc. Ravses noticed among the nest of fabrics were piles of clothes strewn about the edges like bedding distributed by an animal or bird, without any concern for folding or the welfare of the clothes themselves. Ravses gently held Ortor's shoulders and began backing toward the stairs, when Piecora suddenly sneezed several times from the musty, icy air. Valesh squeaked and ran back to the stairs as the lizard opened a large yellow eye, blinked several times, and then saw the intruders. Immediately and fluidly in a single motion, it sat up into an erect seated position, revealing the fullness of the large reflective disc behind it and the misshapen ice structure that surrounded and framed it. The sounds of the lizard's sudden movement echoed like the drawing of 100 blades as its scales glided seamlessly over each other. Here and there, bright sparks flew from its joints and scraping metal hide. On the ground, the nest of fabrics and clothing was indented in the shape of the sleeping lizard, and now the air slightly shimmered just above it as the lizard's collected warmth quickly dissipated into the freezing chamber. For several moments, no one made a sound as Ravses, Ortor, and Valesh placed their feet on the bottom stair behind them. But Piecora remained inside the chamber, with her bow held in one hand. "Piecora!" whispered Ravses desperately, unsure why the Sienjan wasn't retreating like the rest of them. "Be calm," said Piecora without breaking eye contact with the lizard who stood as still as a statue. "We would already be dead if it meant us harm." Piecora slowly moved closer to the nest, and with the tip of her bow, she slowly lifted a black velvet-padded vest, smelling of several varieties of strong alcohol. Ravses couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in truth, she couldn't understand why she wasn't already running up the ancient stone steps with her son and Valesh. "I had my suspicion, and now I know," said Piecora flatly, tossing the vest back onto the lizard's nest. "Eindon Javangshan is no human name. It's a dragon's name, isn't it? Eindon Vandus?" The lizard's large eyes briefly and mechanically flicked down to the vest that landed onto its nest, and then back at Piecora. It made no other move or sound. "What are we doing here, Eindon?" pressed Piecora further as she stepped into the nest, toward the shimmering ice disk. "I know a portal when I see one. Where does this one lead?" She reached the disk of ice, and to Ravses she was a small silhouette against what looked like a vertical frozen pond encased in ice. Piecora reached up and briefly touched its surface, and to Ravses's surprise it rippled like water. "I know you can speak to me, dragon," said Piecora, looking over at the large lizard. "I've dealt with your kind before. Do you know the name Bogian Crimeran?" A deep, raspy voice from the metal dragon's throat slowly uttered the word "Aeon worm" that caused the chamber to rumble like a mild quake, sending clouds of dust and flecks of ice down from the high ceiling above. The sound filled the chamber and floated up the steps. "The one and the only," said Piecora. "Will you tell us now what this is all about?" She slowly stepped away from the disk of shimmering ice and approached the dragon while returning her bow to her lower back. She held her empty hands wide, gesturing that she meant no harm or violence to the metallic dragon. Now at its full height, the dragon's head towered over Piecora by at least 3 of her as its head scraped the rime-crusted ceiling. Slowly and fluidly, the lizard lowered itself down to a lying position, so its large head was more even with Piecora's. It seemed to Ravsez that its belly was sensitive to the cold floor, as it waited until the last second before finally succumbing to its weight and letting it lay fully connected to the ice beneath it, while wrapping its long tail around itself. The metallic beast shivered all over from being driven from its nest, and it sounded like 100 bags of loose sword blades being shaken all at once. Then Ravsez heard a deep, rumbling voice in her mind, and judging by the others, they all heard it too. "Forgive my intrusion into your mind." It began heavily, as if finally reaching a decision after much deliberation. "But it is difficult for me to speak your words in this form, and you are the first to discover this place uninvited. But I've decided not to eat you for now. Instead, I shall play this part out and see where it leads." The metal dragon finally came to rest against the wall, just outside its nest. Then it spoke again within their minds. "I am Eindonjevangshen of the Kiakudius Untai Nanua, or those who watch the door in High Canonian. May his name be praised. We were also called Inai Tori Insamundi, the Porters of Worlds, when we were many and strong before the breaking of the world. To you, I am Eindon. If you were to live beyond this meeting, nothing I say must be known to anyone else. If I learn otherwise, I'll know who to find." Before Ravsez could even think about what she just heard in her mind, Piecora said in a voice that rang clear with annoyance in the icy chamber, "Perhaps I didn't emphasize the name Bogion Krameran to you, Worm. Or is it that she is beneath your station, and you care not? I am a friend of the Aeon Worm. Queen of Kiahala, the encircling forest, the trees move as one. She has been alive since the making of Cynthia, whom I am also friends with. So, before you threaten us with choosing her friends as your next meal, would you be up to the challenge if she learns of our fate? Would you welcome her if she comes for you?" "It is her name that affords you my delay in action, and our time to speak civilly, Xianjian." "But only for the moment," murmured Eindon in their minds. His voice rumbled like hot, molten steel poured into a funnel. It tickled and vibrated Ravsez's ears when he spoke inside her mind. "You are the ones who wandered into my home after all." Thick plumes of steam billowed from Eindon's nostrils as it sighed in frustration. Ravsez could hear a slight crackling sound, like fine cracks developing in ice, and it seemed as if the dragon's once gleaming metal scales were losing their luster as the dragon's hide slowly succumbed to the bitter cold. The huge beast shuddered again, agitated by the cold and the interlopers interrupting its rest. "Then perhaps you do not remember us," said Piecora, continuing to step toward the dragon. "Ravsez, show Eindon his signet ring that he gave us to purchase an expedition to the wildlands. Remember the party, Eindon? Remember Rultin, or Ashavai, in the Bishop's Lament?" "I'm still sleeping it off," mumbled the dragon darkly in their minds. Ravsez cautiously stepped forward and showed the lounging dragon the ring, while being careful to not show the other ring she wore on her other hand, the one she found on the mantel in the room upstairs that gave her the cataclysmic vision, the one that she could not seem to take off. "We do not choose to be here, Eindon," Piecora said flatly in aggravation. Her son wandered off and... "Where is Aotor now?" Ravsez, who had left the stairs to approach the dragon, whirled around behind her to see if Aotor was there, but he wasn't. Whipping her head back around in sudden panic, she found both her son and Valesh right up against the shimmering disk of ice. His hand was raised and submerged elbow-deep inside the shimmering icy disk. "Aotor!" shouted Ravsez, A concussive force knocked them all backward except for Artor, who remained standing where he was with his arm inside the icy portal. Valesh jumped back up and reached Artor first, embracing him and lifting him up. Ravzese felt like her bones were made from lead, and her muscles and limbs responded with excruciating slowness compared to her racing thoughts. As she tried to get up and reach the children, shadowy figures emerged from the portal from the other side. No, they weren't mere figures. Horned bipedal monstrosities made from calcified marrow covered in ice leapt from the portal, as if diving into the chamber from whatever world lay on the other side. Each creature bore large horns protruding from their heads. Some curved like ram's horns, others were straight and spiralled like deer found in the savannah of Unviland, and still others were bent outwards or behind like goat's horns, similar to her own and Artor's. They had long, wiry tails like her and her son, but that's where the similarities ended. Their veiny skin looked as if it were turned inside out and stretched over their bones and sinews like glued paper. Their faces were garish, gaunt horrors of stretched frozen epidermis over jagged skulls lined with horned ridges and split by gaping jaws. Their sunken eyes were wild with perverse intelligence and hideous, fatalistic fanaticism. Some had leathery wings, others had hooves and legs bent at odd angles. But all were hideous, lurid, personifications of pure evil. All were revelling with grotesque laughter at the violence they intended, and all were coated in thick, fractured, flaking layers of ice. They reached for Artor, and several grabbed Valesh and strove to drag her back into the icy portal. This captured Artor's attention, and as he looked at her from the corner of his eye, Ravzese beheld her son's silhouetted form suddenly erupt in an array of black, writhing appendages, similar to what she saw come from Venexi all those nights ago, when she and her son were captured in Coast Haven during the wagon chase across the town. Valesh screamed just as each black, writhing worm pierced and mutilated every monster emerging from the portal. Pieces of meat, splashes of black ichor, and amputated limbs flew in all directions. Piecora ran to Artor, swinging her hatchet wildly at more horrors invading the primal realm from beyond the icy portal, and Artor pushed his other hand into the liquid ice, while several black tentacles slowly wrapped around Valesh, protecting her from the incoming horde of devils. An ear-shattering bellow came from Eindon, and Ravzese saw the dragon bracing to leap. Sparks rained down from above as its wings scraped against the ceiling, and before its gaping maw, she saw the air rippling with its hot breath. But in her mind, she heard its words, "Belmaugri, Belmaugri returns. Praise Belmaugri, he is alive." Then, as if this moment weren't already something conjured from all of her nightmares, two leathery wings suddenly grew from her son's back, glowing white and hissing with steam as their intense heat met the icy air of the chamber. Several creatures grabbed Piecora, but these were answered swiftly by the whipping, crushing tendrils originating from within Artor. Ravzese, lying on her back in catatonic shock and fear, noticed the frozen stalagmites that framed the portal melting rapidly as clear, freezing water pooled on the ground like a slow-rising flood. Several garments of Eindon's clothing drifted toward Ravzese as if they were lazily animated greeters coming to welcome Ravzese to the nightmare unfolding before her. Another bellow from Eindon, also accompanied by words inside Ravzese's mind, and sparks flew from its limbs and wings. "Champion of Belmaugri, he is among us. Lord be praised. He shuts the portal to hell. Defend him." Then Eindonjevang Shun, the metal-scaled dragon, leapt onto the top of the portal, digging its powerful claws into the melting stalagmites and biting the edge of the shimmering circle itself. Sparks flew everywhere like jettisoned flecks of steel from a blacksmith's wheel and showered all over the chamber. The icy water reached Ravzese and flowed around her, and as a pair of Eindon's breeches gently lay upon one of her arms, she snapped out of her stupor. Shaking her wet hair and jumping up, she ran headlong into the nightmare to save her son, as his white wings suddenly grew larger with Belmaugri's power. Upon reaching him, she fell on her hands and knees and wrapped her arms around both him and Valesh, who was still embraced by the thick appendages protruding from his body. Ravzeze looked up at Artor and saw in his torso a gaping vertical wound from clavicle to navel. Dozens of writhing, prehensile worms of various sizes and lengths protruded from the wound, whipping around at the onslaught of monsters from the other side of the portal. But his wound did not bleed, nor was there any pain on his face. A strong scent of salty brine reached Ravsis's sinuses that reminded her of Coast Haven and the dream she had in the bilge of the Wellenbrecker. Artor looked down at her like a carpentry teacher gently scolds a child too close to their sharp tools and said, "Mumi, move back, please, don't get hurt." He spoke the words quietly and calmly, and she heard them as if spoken right into her ears. Ravzeze let go and scrambled back through the icy water to the steps as her son had advised, dumbfounded in shock. She threw herself onto the ground just as another heavy blast of cold air pushed outward from behind her, and a violent deluge of water and ice rushed over her like a wave crashing on a beach. Einden's wet breeches landed on her shoulder and clung to her as if it were a drenched animal seeking safety. It suddenly went quiet, save for the sound of sloshing water. It reminded Ravsis of snowmelt rushing along the sides of the street beneath islands of snow in the winter, and her consciousness drifted along its turbulent current like a brittle leaf as it was swept away into darkness. Ravsis awoke in total darkness until her eyes focused on the shimmering ice portal before her. Its surface was ice, yet it rippled and shifted as if it were liquid. Soft crackling sounds came from all around it, along with a light mist, as the inhumanly cold temperatures of the portal mingled with the more temperately cold environment of the primal world that she was in. No one else was inside the room. Slowly she got up from lying on her back and faced the portal with terror. However, there was also something else. In some deeply remote pocket of her psyche was a sense of familiarity or remembrance or yearning that seemed to stretch across generations of her past. Something gnawed at her from a heritage she never knew about and could never identify with, though it still laced her with shame for not recognizing who she belonged to and guilt for not desiring to. This deep, familial presence mocked her cruelly for abandoning a purpose she knew nothing about and betraying an ideology that was foreign to her. And yet, it came from within her. She felt split between multiple identities that conflicted with her own that she made for herself. And since bearing Artor into this world, motherhood became the bedrock of her identity. It was this very thing that this ancient presence within her hated, not necessarily the notion of motherhood, but specifically Artor. Something inside of her hated Artor with all of its essence, and as she lingered on these thoughts, she felt bile rise up within her. How can this even be possible? How can she hate her own son? As she wrestled with these thoughts, the large muscular man she had dreamt of before stepped through the liquid ice from the other side, the man with the beautiful white horns and long flowing hair and beard, and the wide, powerful white leathery wings unfurled from his back. Gently, he picked her up and carried her like a child to the steps on the other side of the room. Then he kissed her forehead and said in his deep, baritone voice, "Mumi, stay back, please." As he turned and strode across the room back to the portal, he briefly looked back at her and signed, "I love you," with his hands using one of several Unscavian street sign language dialects, before stepping through the icy portal. Ravzes bolted upright from the couch in the study above the chamber and shouted, "Artor!" She reached forward with both arms, straining to grasp her grown-up son through the evaporating vestiges of her dream. "I'm right here, Mumi," said Artor, once again the child that she remembered. He was sitting at her feet on the couch, and swiftly she leaned forward and hugged him tightly, never wanting to let go. Gone were his ethereal wings and the horrors that burst from his torso before the icy portal in the chamber far below. His hair was wet and smelled like salty brine, but he wore different clothes that were dry and way too large for him. Briefly, she checked his chest with her hand and felt a slight vertical scar before recoiling her hand quickly. He wrapped his arms around her in response, and she sobbed quietly in his hair, thinking she must be losing her mind. "What's happened to my son?" she thought to herself. "What happened down there? What have I done to him? Why did we leave Muth?" She felt slender arms around them both, and looking up from the corner of her wet eyes, she saw Valesh's face close to hers. "It's all a bit much for all of us. Right now, isn't it?" Valesh said matter-of-factly despite her quivery voice. For several moments the three of them held each other in the warmth of their collective embrace. Ravses felt a shadow pass over her, and Piecora gently lifted Artur and sat down on the couch at Ravses's feet with Artur in her lap. Piecora was not wearing new clothes. She was still sodden wet, and her thick braids hung heavily around her face. "Welcome to wakefulness, my sister," Piecora said in a calm, low voice. "We have much to discuss." She then looked away, and following her eyes Ravses saw Eindon, now in recognizable human form dressed in a loose white shirt and black baggy trousers, seated in an upholstered chair by the desk. He looked exhausted with his black hair hanging all around his face, and he nodded warmly to her, but without smiling as he worked at stuffing a long wooden pipe full of pungent ground leaves. His face conveyed sobriety and seriousness, unlike the ridiculous man she met that night in the bishop's lament. "What happened to my son?" Ravses quietly demanded. Valesh sat on the carpeted floor next to the couch and held Ravses's hand. "An appropriate first question to lead us off, milady," said Eindon, his high, lyrical voice familiar to Ravses from their first meeting, but without the drama or drunkenness. "But first let me say it is good to see you awake from your previous state. We were all concerned for you. Artur never left your side. He blames himself, you know, for all of it. But that is nonsense. Perhaps you can convince him of that. He not only saved all of us, but likely saved this city, or at least contributed to it. As to your question, several things, in fact, have happened to your son, and are still happening. I will start with the prominent. Artur has the blessing of Belmaugri, and with this blessing come gifts and powers that my people haven't seen since the Cataclysm, and this gives me great joy mixed with solemn reverence for your son. Through this blessing your son has shut the way into Panyalivanu, the desolation of rime, which is the 8th realm of the 9 hells, a threshold which I have guarded for centuries." "What is Belmaugri?" asked Ravsese. "Belmaugri is our god. He ruled over Aquala, our kingdom, ere the sundering of the world, when we were plenty and righteous. But the cataclysm all but destroyed dragonkind. Only I and a few others remain to this day, and I do not include Bojan Krameran in this, for she is the Aeon worm. She is as old as the world, and her tale is separate from my own. Belmaugri was our god, but then he was silenced after the cataclysm, and we do not hear his voice any longer. Many of us feared he was lost, but a few of us hope that he may still live in a weakened state, vulnerable, so he hides and protects himself until he becomes strong again. We who believe this pray for his return, but not one among us has seen a sign, until now. I saw it with my own eyes down there. Your son is blessed by Belmaugri, which means our god still lives." "You speak of ancient times," said Ravsese, "of the war between devils and dragons, Pidzausu por Tiraka, of the 5th age, the time of war. But how can you say this of my son, who is Devilkin, your enemy?" "You know much, Unscavian, of our shared history," said Eindon. "But that was a long, long time ago. Devils are our sworn enemy, not Devilkin. We few who remained after the cataclysm debated much on this until we came to a carefully enshrined agreement. that we would not hold the progeny of humans and devils to blame for the harms brought into the world by the deeds of their forebears. We hold the Unscavian people blameless and without crime or sin, and we desire as much as they to some day find a land of their own, to rule without tyranny or oppression. But why? Why, my son? Pleaded Ravsis. She looked at him and saw his usual blank face staring at the ground, but she knew he heard every word and remembered everything. I do not know, said Eindon. May I ask who his father is? Ravsise paused before answering, wondering for a moment if she should divulge the information. But then she quickly cast her concerns aside, thinking now was not a time for secrets. Dorglir, son of Dorian Veklischer, Chancellor to King Mendilshus Numan of Muth. Eindon leaned back and looked thoughtful for a moment. Then he said, I know the name. House Veklish. It is a powerful house, but not one counted among Nalupizausu, the country of devils that we warred with. No, it was one of our own, but the line was a different name ere the founding of Muth, when those great houses developed their own language. I suppose they wanted to completely cut themselves off from the past and start over. Many of the first houses of Muth felt the same. Many came from both Aquala and Nalupizausu, with the same intentions to re-identify themselves and forge a new destiny together. How well do you know this history? Do you know the name Macanon? Ravsis shook her head. No, I don't. It is the house of Canonia Buren Macanon, founder of these very lands after the Salt Sea was formed. House Macanon was House Veklischer before the war. Something, isn't it? Ravses's head reeled. Are you saying that the Veklischer line were humans allied with... She lost her train of thought at everything this represented, and it was too much for her to properly process. Not allied, as you say, but one of us. Aquala was not only a kingdom of dragons. Humans served us in Aquala, and there was great harmony between our kinds. We were lords over the human houses of our lands, and we ruled over their fiefdoms. For a while, there was a golden age of prosperity until certain human houses desired to leave our country and make a land of their own, to be ruled by humans. We allowed this to happen without question, of course, but they sowed deceit among those who wished to remain with us, saying that we were tyrants and monstrous overlords, that we hoarded their wealth and ate their children during annual lotteries. All sorts of nonsense, of course. All manners of lies were spread about us to coerce as many houses to leave as possible. Eventually, House Macanon went with them and changed their name to Veklischer, but they never cavorted with devils, to our understanding. They were among the human houses of Nalupizausu, who left Aquala, but did not mingle with devils. They were one of the pure houses who remained human and shunned those who sought the powers of the 9 hells, and so it is no surprise that they still exist today as House Veklischer. For Muth was created by the surviving houses of Nalupizausu, who remained pure in their humanity after the cataclysm. They took pity on the offspring of their evil peers, gathering the devilkin, and welcoming them to live with them in Muth. Some of us were even instrumental in this effort, and I was among them, as we also took pity on the devilkin, and held them blameless for sins they never committed. These purely human houses called their new home on the peninsula Muth, and within their capital city Norschlan, they designated a district called Eindungzirk to house the devilkin that they would call Unskavia, and henceforth the Unscavians were walled off and hidden from the rest of the world. But you know much of that history already, if I understand you at all, young Ravsesi. Ravsese let all of this sink in before asking, how does this answer the question? Why Otor? Why my son? Eindon shrugged his shoulders. I don't know, I honestly don't. To my eyes he comes from 2 rich and powerful lines, the Veklischer, who are descended from House Macanon, who served the dragons of Aquala, served Belmaugri and the Dragon Lords directly, and whose hero Canonia founded this very country, and your own line, which remains a mystery to me except for this. and I do not say this lightly, each and every Unscavian comes from noble blood. There are no exceptions to this. Every single one of you is a rightful lord deserving of their own lands, down to your most meagre of beggars on Eindungzirk's main street, Strasse de Hullen, the path of the hells. For only human females among the evil houses of Nalupizausu were allowed the privilege to lie with the lords of hell and give birth to the devilkin, and these bloodlines continue to this day through each one of you. Mark my words, there is power in your lineage, Rav sees, and that of your son. Rav Sise said quietly, I remember, Vaishlerimund, the white moon, was full the night Ortor was born. I could see it through the open window above my head, and its light shone down upon me. Those who were in the room with me, they were my surrogate family. They rejoiced at the presence of the full white moon watching us from the night sky. They called his birth a blessing. They danced and sang around me. They burned effigies and filled the room with thick clouds of incense that gave the moonlight physical form over my body. I felt weightless, and I thought I was in a dream as Auator came into the world. I felt nothing, no pain, no effort, and then he was in my arms. I cried tears of joy and sadness as I held my son for the first time, wondering what kind of home I could provide for him in Muth, where we both were hated by our lords. I felt purpose for the first time in my life, that I would take Ortor as far away from Muth as I possibly could, so that he could grow, learn, and live his life in this world on his own terms. But since leaving Muth, I always question whether I made the right choice for him, for both of us. You made the right decision, said Piecora after a moment. Muth was no home for Ortor, or you, and we both know that. Furthermore, said Eindon, I might venture to suggest that leaving Muth allowed Belmaugri to bless Ortor unabated by whatever conditions, politics or drama might have been around Ortor if he stayed in Muth. Then Eindon stood up, walked over to Ortor, who still sat in Piecora's lap, and kneeled. For now, I know that Belmaugri lives through this blessed young vessel. This is a joyous occasion indeed. He then took Auator's little hand and kissed it, saying, I am your servant, and I will protect you at all costs, my lord. May you be praised. Ortor stared at Eindon blankly, but Ravses could tell that many different things were in motion behind his young, expressive eyes. Strangely, his face suddenly reminded her of Dorglir more in this moment than ever before. Tell us now about the other, said Ravses slowly. The other what? Asked Eindon. Ravsese gently pulled down the large shirt covering Auator, revealing the thin vertical scar on his chest. Tell us about this, she said. Eindon looked at the child's scar for a long while, his eyes shifting slightly and rapidly, as if reading from a dozen books at the same time. It was the first time Ravses noticed something different about Eindon, something completely non-human but reptilian, and although she had now witnessed the dragon's multiple forms, only after this moment could she truly understand the dual nature of this ancient creature, and that no matter what guise Eindon Jevangshun took, he was the same being, a dragon of mythical origins and untold power and presence, plucked right out from legend and manifested here before her. She wondered how many more there were like him, hiding among the various cultures of the world. She wondered if there were any more here in Canonia, or in her homeland, Muth. Then she mused to herself that if she had never left Muth, she wouldn't have met Eindon, and therefore would have never learned the true existence of dragons in the world, hiding in plain sight all along. Finally, Eindon rose and sat heavily in his large, richly upholstered chair. He fidgeted with his goatee and said, He is afflicted by a disease known as ichthyophaloxu, and I cannot cure him. Ravsez waited for more, but Eindon fell silent. Finally, Piecora stood up, placing Auator on the ground to sit close beside Valesh, and said, We know there is more to it, Eindon. I have a dear friend with this same affliction. We know it comes to those crossing the salt sea from Muth, but only Unscavians, never the humans." "Not true," said Eindon, cutting her off. "Ichthephalloxu's accord is not only meant for Unscavians, although it desires them more than any other. No, sometimes it reaches into humans and all else that crosses the ocean at its deepest depths. It will use anyone it can find to do its bidding, devilkin or otherwise." "Why did it enter my son?" asked Ravsesi defensively. "He is a child. He has no leverage, no strength against such a thing." "He has more than you give him credit for, young Ravsesi," said Eindon. "Ponder this for a moment. That a child so young in his years, so undefiled by the world's influences, so pure in his mind, so simple in his perception of everything, unburdened by obligation, unadulterated by coercion, incapable of seduction of riches, lust, fame, lands, love, or any other adult aspirations that he will undoubtedly succumb to as he grows older. And this is just counting him as a normal boy, without even mentioning the blessing of Bel Maugri and all of the power and strength that provides. No, your child is a haunted fortress who contains the disease known as Ichthephalloxu, fortified by the power of Bel Maugri. Oh, little did the creature know who your son really was. Ortor will manage this better than anyone I have ever met before." "You speak as if he had a choice," Ravses said angrily. "He is still just a child. I want him to have a normal life. That is why I left Muth." "He did have a choice," said Eindon calmly. "Might I assume that Ichthephalloxu came to you also during your voyage?" Ravsesi recounted the dream that she had of the visitation with Ichthephalloxu. "And you denied the creature what it wanted as collateral to hang over your head while you were sent to complete the task it set for you, didn't you?" "You rejected its offer, didn't you?" said Eindon. "I did," said Ravsesi. "And what made you think that Ortor didn't have the same dream? Do you think such a creature like Ichthephalloxu discerns between adults and children? Do you think anyone is safe as they cross the deep ocean?" Ravsesi didn't answer, as her mind became flooded with doubts and misgivings. Was she the reason why Ortor accepted the creature's offer? Eindon looked at Ortor and said, "Ortor, look at me, child. Did you have a dream like your Mumi described while on the boat with her while crossing the ocean?" Ortor looked at Ravsesi, and Ravsesi nodded slowly and said, "Go on, love. Answer him." Ortor nodded his head affirmatively. "And what did the creature promise you?" asked Eindon. "That Mumi would be safe, that he would help us," said Ortor. Ravsesi's heart swelled at her son's words. Somehow she was always caught off guard when he would say or do something that came from within himself, initiated by any solicitation. She always had to remind herself that her son has a mind of his own. "Now tell me, Ortor," Eindon said slowly. "What was the task that you were supposed to do?" "Find a ring," Ortor said, "and give it to Mumi." "And did you find this ring?" asked Eindon. "No, but Mumi found it anyway." Ravsesi gasped despite herself. "And what was the cost for the creature keeping you and your mother safe, Ortor? What did the creature ask for in return for its help?" Ortor looked down and didn't answer. "Ortor, what did you give it?" asked Eindon. Still, Ortor didn't answer. "He knows what he did was wrong, and he's afraid he'll be in trouble if he answers," thought Ravsesi. "Ortor," Ravsesi said, "please answer the nice man. I promise we will not be angry. You will only be helping us." After tracing invisible lines into the velvet cushion on the couch for several more moments, Ortor then quietly said, "Doddy." Ravsesi quickly looked at Eindon and said, "That's his father, Dorglir. What does this mean?" But then she looked back at Ortor and wondered why her son would name his father to the creature, as if somehow knowing that it implied some ill fate would befall Dorglir. She never really knew how her son felt about his father, as she did everything she could to keep them separated. Eindon sighed deeply and said, I don't know, Ravsesi. I honestly don't know. These things that we are speaking of, they are such abstractions and yet are very real at the same time. It is like the fates themselves, the powers that govern all things. One can avoid such dictates in their lives, but only with great effort and luck. It might feel like your life right now, if the fates decided that you were to stay in Muth. Leaving the peninsula reinforced your own will and independence to live your own life, but now everything seems to work against you, doesn't it? Everything feels like it requires great effort when others seem to live their lives more easily. You are moving against great currents, young Ravsesi, both you and your son, and I commend you on this. Be at peace, young child. Your bravery is boundless, and your strength is ungovernable. Ravsesi felt a shiver run up and down her spine. Someone else said that exact thing to me. Days or weeks ago, I've lost track of time. It was on a boat sailing up the river. Do you know Lord Kethwertis? Eindon grinned sarcastically and snorted from his nose. Ah, the old priest of Dolg, Apollo's very own avatar. Yes, we are acquainted, but he spoke the truth. Silence fell on the group for several long moments until Eindon said, May I see the ring? Ravsesi blinked several times, at first unable to understand what Eindon meant. But then she remembered what Aorta said about his task given by the creature at the bottom of the sea. She wasn't sure what to say, as taking the ring she found on the mantle meant stealing from Eindon. That was if this cursed ring was truly the ring of Tiafuan. She decided to just come out with it, so she stood up from the couch and walked over to Eindon, showing the ring on her middle finger on her left hand. I'm sorry, my lord. I was drawn to it, and now I cannot remove it. The creature gave me the same task as Ortor, but I refused its patronage, so I didn't think it was still something I needed to do. Apparently I was wrong. Is this the ring of Tiafuan? Eindon held her delicate hand lightly as he examined the gold ring and strange iridescent ruby. The very one, he said. And you say you cannot remove it. This answers the rest of my questions and ends any remaining mystery about you and possibly by extension your son. Do you know the story of this ring? He let go of her hand. She drew her hand back as if it was wounded and said, I know nothing about it except the creature, Ikthefaloxu, it said. She trailed off as she tried to remember its words. But then Ortor spoke. Iki told you, Mumi. He said, You are Nalupizausu of the line of Pizauskul, descendant of Sunyakari Ariparla, the sorceress summoner, Empress Tiafuan, who beckoned me into this world during Peralivu, the ritual that brought on the cataclysm that formed the Salt Sea, where I now reside at the bottom, and you now sail upon its surface. Do you remember, Mumi? Ravses could only stare at her son without breathing. No words could come to her as she realized his invisible friend, Iki, was none other than Ikthefaloxu, the creature at the bottom of the sea who now inhabited Aortor. The ring was used in the great summoning that nearly broke the entire world. It ended the war and destroyed both Aquala and Nalupizausu, and created the Salt Sea. It was Empress Tiafuan who conducted the ritual in the hopes of summoning all of the 9 hells upon us. But something went wrong during the ritual, and something else emerged through the portal into our world, something far worse, far greater than her powers could anticipate or control. It was something so foreign, so alien, nobody knows to this day where it came from. And it was so large that it didn't fit through the portal despite stretching the opening far and wide across the lands that were filled by the Salt Sea. Had it fully emerged, our world would have been shattered completely. Ikthefaloxu, the thing at the bottom of the Salt Sea that infests your son and many others, is a remnant of this ritual, and its sole desire is to bring back the one it serves. Thus it reaches for those who are most likely connected to the lineage of the summoner sorceress, the Unscavians, to appeal to them, protect them, and help them in whatever hardship they desire to overcome during their own brief lives. But this comes at the cost of the agreement, the pact, that the receiver must choose something they dearly love to give to Ikthefaloksu as collateral until they accomplish a task given by the creature. The task is always associated with preparing the ritual for the return of its monstrous lord, to fully emerge into our world and utterly destroy it. In your case, it found one directly descended from Empress Tiafuan herself, and so it sent you to retrieve her ring. You refused, so it bargained with your son to do what you would not. The comedy here is, of course, you went and did it anyway, without any help from Artur. And now he is imprisoned within the fortress of your son, like a mouse in a trap. Belmogri be praised. Ravsesa stared at the ring on her finger as Eindon spoke, recalling the cataclysmic vision she saw when she put the ring on. Absently, she described the vision openly to the room. "There it is," said Eindon with finality. "Your vision illustrates everything that happened on that fateful day ages ago, and now we are well on our way to a second cataclysm, at best, or the end of the world, at worst. And since you are of Tiafuan's line, I believe Ikthefaloksu wants you to conduct the ritual yourself. I think the creature is betting everything on you. This is why it inhabited your son." Ravses whirled to face Eindon. "I'll not do such a thing. I'll not use the ring. I want no part of this. I'll never do it. I'll cut off my own finger. Nay, the whole hand." She drew the small knife that she purchased in Knightsport from its sheath, but Piecora was suddenly close behind her and gripping her hand holding the knife. "Wait," hushed Piecora in her ear. "Let us think, first, before we do any such permanent harm to ourselves, love." Ravses felt lightheaded and dropped the knife, and it stuck point first into the arm of the richly upholstered chair that Eindon sat in. Quickly, he removed the knife and set it next to him. "The ring is yours, Ravsesa," Eindon said lightly. "It belongs to you. It is meant for you. It answers only to your authority. The ring is the signet ring of the Empress and Sorceress Summoner of Nalupizausu, and it shall not let go of you willingly. You are a queen, young Ravses, and Artur, he is a lordly prince of great strength from the mixed lines of Tiafuan and Makanan. And now, your son has imprisoned the one who places these dictates upon you. I'd love to claim I was behind it all, pulling the strings and weaving this fine tapestry, but I cannot, for nothing weaves a more complex tapestry of fate than chance. But we must be careful, for these are large, ominous shapes that are in motion all at once, and one misstep could lead to the end of the world. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.